Imagine that you are at the controls of an F-4 Phantom flying combat missions over hostile North Vietnam. A place where one wrong move could mean capture or even death. If that's not enough stress for you, imagine that you've taken heavy damage, you're leaking fuel, but you look over and your wingman's plane is far worse. It's obvious to you that they're not going to make it back, threatening to leave them as prisoners of war. What would you do? Welcome back, everyone, to Aero Exploration and another installment of This Week in Aviation History. Today, we're going to dive into what I think is one of the wildest maneuvers that I've heard of in modern air combat, the Parto push. Now imagine if you had a friend who broke down in the middle of the road and you used your car to push them to safety. This is kind of like that, except for the stakes are way higher and you're using multi-million-dollar jets to do it. But one pilot's split-second decision amidst all of this chaos turned a near-certain disaster into the testament to fighter-pilot brotherhood. So it's March 10th, 1967, and Captain Bob Pardo and his weapons system officer, First Lieutenant Steve Wayne, were leading a bombing mission against heavily defended steel mills near Hanoi. Now, disruption of this steel production was vital to slowing down the North Vietnamese war machine. For this mission, they were flying the F-4 Phantom II, which is a formidable fighter. It's fast, it's heavily armored, and it's versatile. With twin engines, advanced avionics, and a rugged design, it was built for those brutal conditions that they faced during the Vietnam War. Yet even these machines weren't invincible. As they went about this mission, both Captain Earl Aman and Captain Bob Pardo's aircraft would suffer significant damage from anti-aircraft fire. Before reaching their target, Aman's aircraft was hit first and his fuel tank was compromised, causing rapid fuel loss. He had fuel streaming from his wings and his fuselage, and to make matters worse, Pardo's own plane was hit and he too was leaking fuel, but not as badly. So by the time the strike is complete, they climb out and they reach an altitude of around 20,000 feet. At this point, the damage is pretty clear. Captain Aman and his weapons system officer, First Lieutenant Robert Houghton, realized they don't have enough fuel to make it to the KC-135 over Laos, let alone make it out of the hostile territory they're flying over. If they're forced to eject right now over the jungles of North Vietnam, they would very likely be captured with all the grim consequences that entailed. Now, it's in this moment that Captain Pardo makes a split-second decision that he has to do something, refusing to abandon his wingman. He's quoted as later saying, "How can you fly off and leave a guy you just fought a battle with?" So it is in that spirit that Pardo determined he was going to push Aman's falling aircraft to safety, despite his own troubles to his aircraft. So Pardo's initial plan was simple enough. He was just going to get in behind and push the damaged aircraft into safer airspace. So his plan was he was going to snug his F-4's nose against the rear of Aman's aircraft and use his own thrust to push the damaged aircraft to safety. So now as he maneuvered to get into position, he quickly found he couldn't get within 10 feet of Aman's aircraft. Heavy turbulence and jet wash from Aman's plane made this task nearly impossible. So then Pardo decided to have him deploy his drag chute to have another point of contact to push from. Now the drag chute on the F-4 is a parachute at the rear of the aircraft that's deployed upon landing to slow the plane down. So once the chute is deployed, they're able to release it, and at that point, Pardo thought that he would have a flat space inside the compartment that held the drag chute. He was determined to use this point to try again. But again, he found out that the erratic conditions and the turbulence meant he couldn't get close enough to use the drag chute compartment as a push point either. At this point, Aman's condition had gone from bad to worse, with his descent rate increasing from 3,000 feet per minute to 4,000 or 5,000 feet per minute. They were running out of time. So the F-4 wasn't designed just for Air Force operations, but for naval operations as well. So with that meant the aircraft came equipped with a heavy-duty tailhook designed for carrier landings. And as Parto got behind and underneath Aman's F-4, he saw the tailhook. So in a desperate bid to keep Aman's Phantom from plunging, he radioed to Aman, "Put the hook down, I'm going to push you from there." So Parto maneuvered into position underneath and behind Aman and slowly moved forward until the tailhook made contact with his windscreen. From there, Parto was able to use his own thrust to give Aman a push. In doing so, they were able to reduce Aman's descent rate from that 5,000 feet per minute to a more manageable 1,500 feet per minute. Now that they had found success with the push, they quickly found that the tailhook would slide off of Parto's aircraft. This would force Parto to have to repeat this maneuver over and over and over again. Now with each push, he would get 15 to maybe 30 seconds of push time, and the tailhook would just slide off again. Since that hook was made to catch cables on an aircraft carrier, it had a certain amount of play built into it to sway side to side, which is great for when you're trying to catch a cable, not so great when you're trying to keep it in a fixed point on the canopy of an airplane. If all that wasn't enough, the repeated contacts and the constant pressure from the tailhook on the windscreen started to create another problem. An ominous crack had appeared and began to spiderweb across the canopy. Many F-4 canopies during that era were made of laminated acrylic, glass, and other materials in various layers. So it was less prone to those stress fractures under extreme conditions. But this was beyond extreme, and they were having problems. One thing Parto would also have to consider is the repeated contacts against his windscreen and canopy might cause damage to the canopy itself. So should they find themselves in a position where they'd have to eject, which was likely given he was running out of fuel himself, that damage to the canopy might inhibit their ability to eject themselves. Despite these risks, he continued to push Aman's aircraft towards friendlier skies. Now remember that Parto's aircraft has been hit by anti-aircraft fire as well, and as he's performing this maneuver, parts of his own plane are being sucked into the intake of his engines. As minutes pass between the damage to his engine and the stress he's putting it under, his engine catches fire. So in a typical situation, you would shut that engine down and let it ride out on the other engine. But this isn't a typical standard situation. So instead of just shutting it down, he restarts it. And contrary to every bit of his training, he lets that engine run, and it's pegged at its highest temperature reading for nearly 10 minutes. So with his engines burning up, his own fuel running dangerously low, every second now counts. And every second he can push is a little bit closer to friendly skies. Through this challenging ordeal, Parto kept his F-4 flying. Even though it was battered and leaking fuel, he pushed Aman for over 20 minutes. And in that time, managed to push the crippled aircraft almost 88 miles towards safety, until they reached airspace over Laos and an altitude of 6,000 feet. At that point, they had maybe 2 minutes of flying time left, and the choice was made to eject. Once outside of North Vietnam, all 4 aviators were able to safely eject from their aircraft into the jungles of Laos. But their troubles didn't stop there. All 4 men did suffer some minor injuries from the ejection, and they also had to then evade enemy forces who were in that area. The group was able to evade enemy forces for 10 miles before they were eventually rescued by a helicopter. In the immediate aftermath of this, you would think that Captain Parto would be praised as a hero, but instead, senior leaders in the Air Force wanted Parto disciplined for not saving his own aircraft. Though his aircraft was damaged, he would have made it to the tanker and likely back to base, saving his aircraft. But in doing so, what about his wingman? Air Force officials would claim that his move was reckless and showed a lack of flight discipline. But his squadron commander disagreed, and rather than disciplining him, he continued putting him in for awards. That commander, none other than Robin Olds, an aviation legend and triple ace himself. As the full story emerged of what happened over the skies of North Vietnam, these men became legendary. That historic push was re-examined, and both Parto and his weapons officer Steve Wayne were awarded the Silver Star for their gallantry. Facing enemy fire, flying over hostile territory, and knowing that one wrong move could lead to your capture or death. That threat of becoming a prisoner of war in some horrible conditions was very real, and Parto's decision to risk everything for his wingman resonated deeply with airmen then and continues to inspire pilots today. I think this story is just really incredible. It might seem as simple as just pushing your buddy to the side of the road, but this was really a high-stakes maneuver that put both aircraft at risk, and if it didn't go right, they faced some dire consequences. And the fact that Parto acted was truly inspiring. I hope that you too found this to be an inspiring story, and if you did and you want to hear more stories of aviation history just like this, make sure you subscribe to Aero Exploration for more episodes of This Week in Aviation History. Also, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts about this courageous act down in the comments below. Thanks again so much for joining me on This Week in Aviation History, right here on Aero Exploration.